Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our latest Labour Friends of the Forces event. I'm Toby Dickinson. I'm the co-chair of LFF, and it's great to have everyone along this evening for our LGBT History Month event. We're joined by Lieutenant Commander Craig Jones, who's the Joint CEO of Fighting with Pride, and an ex-Royal Navy Warfare Branch officer. And we'll be joined shortly by Luke Pollard MP, our new Shadow Armed Forces Minister, for a discussion on the history behind the lifting of the ban on LGBT personnel serving in the armed forces and some of the background of the campaigns that have gone on since. Before that, though, given what's been happening in the news in the past 24 hours or past 2 months, really, we're very lucky to have John Healey MP, Shadow Defence Secretary, join us to give us a short update on what's been happening on the Ukraine front and on where the Labour Party is with that. So before the main event, I'll just hand over to John for that quick update.
Thank you, Toby. Apologies to you, Craig. I don't want to hijack your meeting. And when Luke joins you, you'll be in very good hands in the Shadow Defence team there. But Toby was kind enough to ask me today, did I want to just join you and give you something of an update of where, from the Labour front bench point of view, we think we are on Ukraine, which I'm very happy to do. And Toby, to say to you and your executive, you asked David Lammy and I when we went out to Ukraine last month to do a report back session for LFF members, if you would like David and I to do something similar next week, specifically on the Ukraine situation and its implications. Be very happy to look to organise that. If you'd like to do that, you just come back to us and let us know.
Super, thank you.
Okay. Very grave violation of international law, the United Nations Charter. We've seen Putin invading and killing Ukrainian people today, despite Russia itself having guaranteed the sovereignty of that country. And this is an act of war. It's something that I've said to the Parliamentary Labour Party and to the Shadow Cabinet today. This is the first time that there is so much open source information. And because we've seen so much disinformation around the Russian buildup, the recent years of Russian aggression around Ukraine and elsewhere, my caution to our Labour MPs and our Labour Shadow Cabinet is to beware of making comments simply based on social media postings. However, there is a regular and reliable source of information. Our defence intelligence, our government, the US government in particular, have been in the lead for some months in using the intelligence and information that our governments have in a much more open way to prevent Putin from using that sort of shield that he's tended to use and have a freer range for his own disinformation and manipulation. Where do we think we are at the moment? Well, look, in summary, it's clear that Ukraine is under attack on multiple fronts, not just including from Belarus, but some indications that the Russian forces are supported by Belarus troops. There are recent reports of very heavy shelling in Mariupol in the south. The Ukrainian government earlier today reported that they'd been subject to at least 200 separate missile fires. There is heavy fighting in some places, particularly on the eastern contact line, and reported heavy casualties on both sides, perhaps heavier fighting than some might have expected. So Putin's plan is to try and complete the military move and movements within days. The longer that takes, the greater risk to his military operations becomes. And so the big unknown question is how strong will be the Ukrainian resistance. What was clear to David Lammy and I when we were there last month is that the resolve of the Ukrainian people to resist is far stronger than it was in 2014, maybe far stronger than Putin allows, and this may be a significant miscalculation. However, there are analysts that believe Kiev could be surrounded by the morning. We have to wait and see. But what is certainly true is that the degree of Ukrainian resistance now lights a fire, in a sense, for longer term Ukrainian resistance that will increase the cost to Putin, because the overall objective must be for us, even if Putin is successful in the short run, he must fail in the longer run with this invasion. A couple of other points perhaps to draw out. We've all been watching and focused on the very visible traditional build-up of hardware and troop numbers around the Ukrainian border. A lot of you come from a military background, so you may also have picked up what most of the mainstream media have not, which is, while we've been watching this, Russian special forces and intelligence cells have been in place in Ukraine for months, leading localized disinformation campaigns, but crucially then switching to a systematic identification of individuals who may be willing to work with them when they bring down, as they aim to do, the Zelensky Ukrainian government. And even more crucially, those individuals with networks, with local status, with influence, who may be the focus of resistance. And so what I think in phase two we should expect to see will be brutal, and it will be a series of snatch squads, of detention, of filtration, and some of the pattern of Putin's method of operation that we've seen elsewhere in different times. Finally, just on the general picture, we should expect Russian aggression not simply to be confined to Ukraine. It's a serious worry for the Baltic countries. It will be a serious worry in Moldova, but especially as our sanctions from the West are applied, we should expect to see disinformation, distraction, Russian activity, cyber attacks, including in the UK. So our homeland resistance and resilience in the UK may well be tested. Finally, then, where are we on the Labour approach to this? Essentially, we've given full Labour support to action on three fronts to date that the UK government has taken. And the Ukrainians have said time again that their best defence is Western unity, and they have appreciated the bipartisanship and the strength of the Labour support. First of all, on the UK's assistance with weaponry, training and kit to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. There is more that they are asking for. There is more that the UK government could offer, and I assume are working on the practicalities of being able to deliver. When they confirm that, when they do that, they will have and continue to have Labour's full support. The second is the focus of a lot of the debate in recent days, which is UK playing a leading part in coordination with allies on the most severe, swift sanctions that we can impose. This is no longer about deterrence, and in truth, Putin has always factored this in, but it must be about increasing the cost to Putin and his elites. And so therefore, two factors are important: the unity of those sanctions and the endurance of those sanctions, alongside the comprehensive range. And despite Boris Johnson's statement in the House of Commons, which I've just come out to join you from, as we start to give close attention to what he's promised again today, I think we'll find that they are weaker than he seemed to be saying, and that it may well be, as Biden confirms the US sanctions tonight, and the EU starts to confirm their sanctions, that the UK's look still to be falling short. So that's the second front, that they'll have our full support, but we'll keep up the pressure because we need to do more. The third then is the UK being willing to step up the reassurance and reinforcement of NATO allies that are on the eastern flank. There's clearly much more that needs to be done in the short term, a significant rethink of longer term NATO structures and strategy. In the short term, to the extent the UK government is willing to play a part of that, to lead that reinforcement of the NATO defences on the eastern flank, again, they will have Labour's full support. And then finally, I think just a bigger reflection, which is that it seems to me that we are going to be dealing with the consequences of this invasion, this act of war today, for many years to come. And I thought it was very telling that Putin, in his speech at 3 o'clock this morning, dropped any of the argument that he's tried to make before, that somehow Russia was only responding to NATO aggression. He was very clearly, it's always been the case that NATO is a defensive alliance. It's not been a direct threat to Russia. But what he set out was a totally uncompromising anti-Western policy. He described the West as an empire of lies. And essentially what he was doing was setting out the lines of a new confrontation with the West, and a new front line, if you like, for Russian aggression towards the West. And underlying this, we must hold fast to the recognition that Putin's real aim in this is to weaken and divide the West, and in some ways to turn the clock back to re-establish that Russian control over neighboring countries. So this is not simply a desperate situation, a tragedy, and the most extreme hostility directed now to the Ukrainian people. This is Putin redrawing and trying to reset the security of Europe, the peace and security that we have come to take for granted since the end of the Cold War, and must know now that we can no longer do so. So listen, I hope that's helpful, just as a sort of a short update, a summary of where I think we are. Probably it would be different in 24 hours time, but that's where we are at present, with Labour underlining very much the sort of strength and the unity that we're prepared to offer in support of UK government action on those three fronts, and on the homeland resilience.
John, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. And we'll definitely look to tee something up next week with you and David Lammy. I think what I'll do, if the audience will let me, is we'll save any questions until then, because there's a decent chance any will be overtaken by events anyway. So if anyone's got a burning question, they're welcome to email me or message me separately, and I'll pass it on to your office. But what we might do is focus on tonight's event and then take the opportunity of a longer, more in-depth session with you and David Lammy next week, if everyone's happy with that. But thank you, John.
Yes, that'll be fine, Toby. Let's do that. We'll fix up directly with you a session where David and I can offer to brief and discuss with LFF members the latest situation. I will ask Luke Pollard if he'll join us as well. Luke, alongside Stephen Doughty as the Shadow Foreign Office Minister, and David and I are working particularly closely to lead the Labour response on this. And so we'll be at your disposal. You just contact us directly, Toby.
That's great.
We'll fix that up.
Right.
Thank you all. Craig, I'm going to step away now. Thank you for making yourself available for this session with LFF. And Luke, I look forward to hearing from you how it goes a little bit later. Thank you all.
Brilliant. Thank you, John. Thanks for your time.
Good night.
Thanks. Okay, so as I say, to all the attendees, I'll speak to John's office later on or tomorrow, and we'll we'll sort something out in terms of an event next week, and we'll get that advertised as soon as we can, so everyone's got a chance to put it in their diary in good time. What I'll do now, Luke's in the room, is I'll hand over to Luke and let him introduce the next part of the session. Stephanie Peacock, of course, she can't join us tonight. She's sick and sends her apologies. But we've got Luke with us, our new Shadow Armed Forces Minister, MP for Plymouth Sutton Devonport, Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme graduate, and the Royal Navy lead on the Armed Forces APPG. Luke, over to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Toby. And good evening, all. As a massive gay, as I described myself in the House of Commons this week, I'm really pleased that we are having this event because I think it is worth pausing sometimes to look at the progress that has been made in LGBTQ plus politics and the changes that have been made. These did not happen by accident. They happened because people fought for them. And people took long, hard campaigns, and we won eventually. The last Labour government was transformative for the LGBT plus community, not just in terms of getting rid of the cruelty of Section 28. And if you have grey hair like me, you probably were at school at the same time as Section 28 and know what a hideous cruelty it meant, how it forced so many people to feel devalued, to feel unsupported, to feel abused, but also that Labour made big strides in terms of allowing adoption for same-sex couples, introducing civil partnerships that paved the way for equal marriage that only passed with the support of Labour MPs. But we're here tonight to talk about the importance of LGBT people being able to serve in our military. And that was an important milestone that was passed by the last Labour government, with the help of the courts, it is worth noting as well. But it was a position that was then thoroughly embraced by the Labour government at the time. And that is a position that it is worth just pausing to think about, because I have friends that were dismissed from the armed forces for being gay. I have some friends that have actually rejoined the armed forces since that ban was lifted, to continue serving the country, to continue upholding the values of our brilliant armed forces. But there were many people for whom being themselves was not just something that would make you lose your job, but was a criminal offence as well. And so it is worth pausing to think about what it was like to be in the closet at that time, or to be semi-out, or to have the threat hanging over you about what would happen if you were true to yourself, if someone else who knew were to use that against you. And that big change, that big moment, I have to say, was quite significant. What it has done, though, is that it then started a process of the military becoming, in many cases, some of our most celebrated LGBT plus employers. It didn't happen overnight, and it took a culture change within our military to start the adoption and then an eventual celebration of the contribution of LGBT plus service personnel. We are not yet there on all the implications of it. It was only the past few months where actually medals and recognition awarded to LGBT people that were denied because of their service and their sexuality have been restored. We haven't got the full compensation for that. We've had apologies, which are welcome and important for those people who suffered. But for me, the real victory in this is not in the change of the law. It's not in a court judgment. It's in the different culture that we now have in our armed forces. And it is always quite a shock and welcome one for me when I'm doing school visits, when I see young people who are out and able to be themselves. And I remember what it was like being a spotty, awkward, in the closeted teenager. I'm really wishing that I could just be who I knew I was, but I knew that I wasn't able to. The joys of going to school under a Tory government. But that was also the experience for many of our LGBT people in the armed forces. The fact that now the RAF, the Army, the Royal Navy are heralded by Stonewall an organisation that Labour is proud to support, by the way, unlike the government, as good equality employees, I think is a huge victory for that culture change that we wanted to achieve. Because that legal recognition, that change in the law is important. But the fact that LGBT people should be able to serve their country, should be able to do so with distinction, only based on their skills, not based on their sexuality, that's enormously powerful. And as a member of the All-Party Armed Forces Group, something that I've been proud to be since I was elected in 2017, when I go to visit our military installations and our training establishments in particular, speaking to recruits in particular who come from the LGBT plus community, my God, I get the same feeling as I did when I visited those schools of going, wouldn't that be amazing? Just thinking about the opportunities that were missed or lost, the pain that's been avoided, but also how we now have some incredible people coming through in our armed forces that otherwise Britain would have discarded. That skill, that passion, that commitment was something that was not there. And I think we need to take a moment to think about that, to celebrate it. But if we are taking a moment to think about the progress that's been made, I also want us to just to pause and think about how progress can go backwards. Because Labour's committed to LGBT plus people. This week, I spoke in the debate on the reform of the Gender Recognition Act, something which is long overdue and something that we as a Labour Party would be implementing swiftly if we had a Labour government. I prefer the Tories to get on with it personally, but it needs to happen. But you can also see going backwards. And the best example of that is our largest ally when it comes to the military, which is the United States of America. Under President Trump, he targeted, in particular, trans people. I'm sorry for mentioning his name, scaring people off, but he targeted trans people as part of a culture war and used the stereotypes and the tropes that we have become accustomed to in attacking that group. Now, it wasn't that group alone. That was a part of a culture war that would have effectively extended to all LGBT service personnel in the US. But by weaponizing trans people and using it as a lever to force out, to argue, what he did was attempt to attack the entire community, ignoring the service of US forces, ignoring the contribution they've made to the US national security, ignoring the medals that many of them wear on their chest. He did so because of a hate-filled policy of division. Now, if that can happen in America, it can happen here. And sometimes we are only a few years behind what happens in the US, sometimes with technological innovations, sometimes with military equipment, sometimes with culture. And one thing we must be mindful of, I think, especially at a time of heightened international tension, is what are the values we are trying to protect? Yes, it's freedom. Yes, it's democracy. Two principles that are deeply under threat in Ukraine and across the eastern flank at the moment. But actually, when you peel that back as well, what it means to be free, it means LGBT people able to be themselves. It means LGBT people able to serve in our armed forces free from discrimination. Now, there's still work to be done there. I think sometimes politicians like myself say LGBT plus, sometimes with a Q in it, as if it's one word, as if it is a homogenous group of fabulous people. Well, it might be in part, but actually there's a different lived experience for people who are L, G, B, and T. The intersectionality is also something we need to be aware of. So lots of our LGBT debate is actually cisgendered white blokes. Well, as a cisgendered white bloke, I can say there's a case for equality for me, but actually the platform that's afforded to me as a member of parliament means I should use that to speak about people who are lesbians in our armed forces and our community, people who are bisexual, people who are trans, people who are non-binary, and the whole wonderful array of the extent of humanity that we know exists. And we need to keep protecting that and keep making the case for it. And I think events like this are really important to provide a moment of reflection as to what we still have to do. There's still progress that needs to be made. LGB progress in the armed forces has been much better, in many cases T, but there's still a lot more work to be done. And that is a challenge that all our armed forces are keen to address at a senior level. And we need to make sure that's reflected in the operational priorities of units and ships, but also in the training establishments, for whom actually in the militarization phase of training is making sure that one of the values that's I was going to say beaten into people, but that's certainly not the case anymore. That is instructed into folks is about equality, recognizing the value of diversity, and recognizing that when you go into combat, yes, you are there to achieve your nation's objectives, but actually you're there to support the person alongside you. And that person alongside you is your comrade in arms. And whether they fall in love with a man or a woman, whoever they identify as, whoever they are your comrade in arms. And that, I think, is a principle which many people who serve will find familiar. You are with the people in your team, however you define that. And we need to, I think, as a movement, make sure that when there are those folks who seek to divide us, who seek to peel off one group and other them as part of it, we make the case that actually our armed forces are the very best of us, and they must reflect that value of decency and celebration of the diversity that we have in Britain. And I think if we can do that, that's a good thing. Now, Toby, I've been stuck with Ukraine for most of the day in my head. So if you can forgive me for probably pausing there, but I'm really keen to hear people's experiences about being out in our armed forces, about what we still need to do, because I think it's important we look at that, but also the progress that has been made, because I think there is much to celebrate, but there's still much to do. And I'll be really keen to be in listening mode for a bit, if that sounds okay. But thank you very much for inviting me along this evening.
Look, that's great. Many thanks for your perspective. I think what we'll do now is hand straight over to Craig, and to get his long-term view of the campaigns he's been involved in and his experiences over the past 25 years. So, Craig. Unmute.
Correct it. Lovely. Thank you very much. And Toby, thank you very much for inviting me along. And Luke, thank you very much for your work on behalf of veterans, serving personnel and families and the LGBT plus community. Along with the brilliant Caroline Page, I'm the Joint Chief Executive of Fighting with Pride, and really pleased to be joined this evening in the audience by Commander Rowley Woods, who's one of our trustees, and also Carlos Timbihan, the LGBT advisor to diversity advisor to Andy Burnham, and one of our brilliant trustees. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey and talk a little bit about the years before the ban was lifted and the years after. And I also want to talk to you about our campaign for restorative justice for LGBT plus personnel who served before the ban. And on that journey, I'm really pleased to say that Labour's support has been absolutely outstanding and already game-changing. I think with that continued support, I hope we're set for a different future for the community whom our charity serves. From a personal perspective, I joined in 1989 and served for 20 years in the Royal Navy, or just short of. I knew I was gay when I walked through the main gates at BRNC Dartmouth, because I'd bought a copy of Radio Times about 4 weeks before, because it had a picture of Michael Ball on the front cover, which is really embarrassing now. But in 1989, he was relatively hot. So maybe Edna Turnblad or Sweeney Todd might not be the same these days. But I joined because I wanted that boy's own career, and I wanted to drive ships and do all those amazing things that we do in the armed forces. So I left my sexual orientation at the main gate, because in those days, as many people on this call know, it was a toxic environment. It was not a safe space for us, and somewhere where we would be hounded down if we were found. And my first few years in the service were exactly that boy's own career. I went straight out to the Caribbean and did counter-drug ops with the US Coast Guard. And soon after that, after a bit of rest in the UK, I retrained at Bryce Norton in helicopter fast rope insertion. I went out to the Gulf after the first Gulf War to do some of the work to clear vessels through the Shatt el Arab. And by the end of that, I kind of felt I'd join the army, and because every time I put a uniform on, it was green. And that continued. I went out to Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and I ran one of the patrols in South Down, doing dolphin vehicle checkpoints, amphibious vehicle checkpoints off the A2 Coast Road, and also lots of boarding operations. And it was in Northern Ireland that my life changed. So I went to do a boarding operation on a fishing vessel off Bangor with an RUC officer, and it was an odd boarding. We got there, we hailed them, nobody came on deck, and I stepped on board this small 2-deck fishing vessel, and we just felt something was wrong. And the RUC officer, sergeant, very bravely said to the young lieutenant, "You stick your head down the hatch, sir, and I'll cover you." So I stuck my head down the hatch and saw 2 older teenage lads in each other's arms on a mattress. And I felt instantly protective, and I was in body armor, so I filled the hatch, and the RUC officer saw nothing. And this was way before the age of consent was reduced from 21. So it was an illegal act. And they got their kit on and came up top, and we questioned them. And afterwards, I went back to my cabin on the ship and put my head in my hands and felt ashamed. I'd just seen 2 young men in the most difficult of circumstances living their best lives. And here was I with my Kevlar helmet and my body armor and my pistol, really a bit of a sham. So I left Northern Ireland about 6 weeks later, went back to the UK, and pretty soon afterwards, assisted by Commander Rowley Woods, who's on this call, met my boyfriend and husband of the last 28 years, achieving efficiency in military dating, I think, for right first time. But as you all know, that changed life from monochrome to Technicolor. How wonderful to have a partner, never have your first relationship at the age of 25. It was just a complete crisis. But nevertheless, meant that in my life now, I was looking over my shoulder, waiting for the day that the Royal Military Police would catch me. And it was a wearying and distracting existence. And I watched so many colleagues march down the gangway by the Royal Military Police, or in my case, the Naval Provost Marshal, over those years. And we lost the most amazing talent from our armed forces, and we lost operational effectiveness because we exited people who were doing amazing jobs and doing them really well for the most irrational of reasons of who you go home to at the end of the working day. And over the years that followed, I became angry about the injustice and particularly about the fact that these were not the values of our armed forces. And I couldn't understand why the heads of our armed forces were supporting the ban. I remember sitting in the carrier in Illustrious in 1996 and reading an open letter from the then First Sea Lord that said, "I hope we never have to serve with queers and lesbians." Unbelievable, unbelievable in terms of leadership. So on the day the ban was lifted, I was operations officer of our amphibious flagship. I actually took the signal, which was for the military signals people here, it was an ABA commanding officers only signal. I took it from the NCO to the captain's cabin, and like all good signals officers, read it on the way through. I thought, ooh, this is going to be lively, because I knew my captain. And I gave it to the captain, and he told me, no names, no pack drill. He told me how disappointed he was to be let down by Whitehall. And it led to a very difficult conversation. I came out on that day because good people before me had fought for my right to serve. The rank outsiders were outstanding people, and they took that case through every court in the land to deliver justice for themselves, but also the opportunity for our armed forces to reflect the value of our nation. And that's what it's all about. And I came out into a toxic and difficult environment for those who were around in those days. I see Michael's on this call, and Michael was out fairly early on. It was pretty rough. And I'd walk into messes and not find many people that would stand next to me in the bar because I was vocal and passionate about what I wanted, what I saw our armed forces could achieve by being properly inclusive. And I wrote lots and lots of letters to admirals and generals and air marshals and politicians, and got quite a few letters of admonishment. And one was for upstaging our second Sea Lord at a conference in June 2004, written in green ink, expressing severe displeasure. And you never know where your luck's coming from. On the Saturday following that, I sat down at Trooping the Colour, having won a couple of tickets in a raffle, next to a lovely old fellow in morning dress. And he turned around to me and said, health warning, I'm about to swear. He said, "How's your week gone, Commander?" Which I thought was very kind, because I was a 2.5 at the time. And I said, "You know, sir, it's been really shit." And he said, "Well, look, I've seen this pageantry 20 times. Tell me about it." And I explained to him how angry I was about the loss and about the damage done, and about the fact that we were missing the opportunity. We were focusing upon a perceived risk that didn't exist, and missing the opportunity to be better armed forces. And he listened and he said, "I agree." And he turned out to be Lord Armstrong of Ilminster, Cabinet Secretary, and one of the most important politicians of the last 50 years, certainly. And weeks later, he introduced me to Labour peer, Admiral Lord West of Spithead, who was then First Sea Lord. And Alan West got it immediately and swept away the recalcitrance and the small c conservatism of commodores and captains and lieutenant generals and all sorts of folks, and said, this is something that we must do because it's our values, it's our shared values. And over the years that followed, we saw all three armed forces join Stonewall's Diversity Champions, a brilliant organisation which supported our armed forces to transform themselves. And remember, that was only 5 years after we locked horns at the European Court of Human Rights. So amazing changes. And our armed forces marched in full uniform at Pride. Alan West stood up against the Army and the RAF, I'm sorry to those who are here on those services today, and said, my armed force will not march in polo shirts through its capital city. And we marched in number ones, which is something that I was very proud of. And we created the armed forces network groups in the years that followed. So incredible achievements. And I think if we fast forward today, I think it's fair to say that our serving armed forces are the best in the world at LGBT plus inclusion. And I wouldn't have believed 20 years ago that we would be saying that. And we have serving personnel who are LGBT plus at the front line of operations all over the world. They do an absolutely outstanding job alongside all of their colleagues. They are welcomed and protected at every level of command, and they're making our armed forces better and more operationally effective. So something to be applauded. But in the 22 years since the ban was lifted, our LGBT plus veterans have been appallingly neglected. They have had no champions. And veterans organisations, I think perhaps because they've had no gays in their villages, have really not looked closely at what's happened to this community that have been so appallingly neglected. So in 2020, a group of us got together and created what was started off as an anthology to tell some of the history of the ban. But by the time we'd written the damn thing, we were so angry that it needed to be a charity. And we were angry because of the damage done. And let's just remind ourselves of what happened if you got caught before 96. You would be taken away by the Provost Marshal and interrogated. And I say interrogated because we're military people, that's the wartime role of the RMP. And once a confession had been achieved, people were sent to military hospitals for inspections, which have no place alongside the Hippocratic Oath. They were then charged with a criminal offence of homosexuality in 1995. And at court-martial, they had their medals ceremonially ripped from their uniforms, and they were sent to prison for 6 months, possibly with 2 weeks remission if they were lucky. After that, they were taken to the main gate. They were dismissed in disgrace from Her Majesty's Armed Forces, given criminal records and letters revoking the right to wear items of uniform, including at the cenotaph, or use their military titles. And these things, by and large, are unremedied. And people have lived lives which have been greatly affected by health issues, finance issues. They have no pensions. Their careers have been ravaged. They were separated from their military families. And in many cases, they were disowned by their own families. And we can understand why in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s that might have happened. So we created the charity together to craft a different future, one whereby our LGBT plus veterans are upheld and their careers are celebrated, and they can live the lives that we hope for all veterans and not be disadvantaged in the way that they have been. And on that journey, Labour have been absolutely amazing. Supported Dan Carden and Stephen Morgan supporting us to get our nose through the door at the Select Committee on the Armed Forces Bill earlier this year, through which we achieved amendments which led to the announcement of the independent review on the 17th of January. And I think it's fair to say that the independent review has brought hope for the very first time to a group of veterans who felt that they were a lost cause and abandoned by their own family, by the military family. And we hope over the next 12 months to enable them to tell their own lived experiences to the chair when that's announced. And we hope that that won't be in the dim and distant future. Because actually, when the veterans tell their own stories, those stories are extremely powerful. And some of them are also extremely sad. And we hope that a wide range of reparations will result. There are other groups in the armed forces who have experienced hurt, and we understand that, and we understand that there are concerns about precedents. But what we would say in Fighting with Pride is that there is no other group in the armed forces who were sent to prison for 6 months just for being who they are and who were dismissed in disgrace. And many of those people who were dismissed in disgrace in their hour of need turned up to veterans charities and were not supported because the charities had a policies of not supporting people who were dismissed in disgrace in those years. So we're asking for compensation for people who live with financial hardships from the ban, and also for the hurt that people experienced by being removed in this way for unfair reasons. We're asking for pensions to be reviewed where people didn't enjoy the careers that they hoped for when they joined the armed forces and were not able to recover their careers, perhaps because they were doctors or nurses or teachers and had criminal records. We're asking for education and settlement, resettlement and training, as we offer all people leaving the armed forces, but clearly we didn't offer these folks. And the other side of what we're doing, which is not so expensive, is that we're asking for measures which will make sure that this group of our veterans feel celebrated, feel that their careers and achievements are upheld, and they feel truly welcomed back into the military family. They need an apology on behalf of the nation. It's all well and good having various junior ministers at some point say, we're really sorry, but that's not good enough. What we did to people was a shameful and a national disgrace, and it must come from the top. We need to make sure that people understand that we want them to wear their uniforms at the cenotaph. This year, 26 members, former members of the armed forces who are LGBT plus, marched in the National Service of Remembrance. They did not wear their berets because they can't. They're service people. They've been prohibited from wearing them, and they will not wear them until they're told that they can. They don't use their military ranks. I have a lovely friend who refers to himself as a former Lieutenant Commander, Duncan Lustig-Preen. And we need to make sure that these folks are welcomed back into the veterans family in a way which is really positive. And I'll just close here and hand over to the floor for a bit of discussion by talking about what the charity is doing and what we hope to achieve. We're working with the Westminster government, we're working with Labour, we're working with the Scottish National Party, and particularly working with the backbench of the government to push reparations as far as we can possibly go. And it's been brilliant to see how Labour has supported us to win that cross-party support. Really, truly amazing. We're working across the veterans sector. We were accelerated into membership of the Confederation of Service Charities by 12 months. to enable us to launch a Pride in Veterans standard. And that standard will hope to enable a group of veterans organisations that are at the very beginning of their LGBT plus inclusion journey to adopt measures which will make sure our veterans feel welcome. The great news is, though, that across the whole of the veterans sector, we have had a brilliant welcome. Every single organisation we have spoken to has said, we want to do this, we must do it, how do we do it? And that, to us, that's music to our ears. We're bringing together our veterans, we're celebrating their careers, we're befriending with them, and we're networking them for mutual support. And with the support of the Armed Forces Covenant Trust, in the next few weeks, we will employ 5 support workers to work across the whole of the United Kingdom. That's a two-way street, so it will give us the opportunity to find these isolated and lonely veterans and connect them in to the reparations process when it starts. And we know we need to be evidence-led, so we have a research programme at Northumbria University led by Professor Matt Kiernan, also a Royal Navy veteran, which is helping us establish what clinical and welfare services we need for the future to support this emerging new veterans need. Thank you very much for listening. That's been the journey of fighting with Pride so far. I know there's a lot of experience and knowledge in the room, so I'm going to hand over to questions and other comments, if that's okay.
Craig, that's great. Thank you very much. That was a really outstanding insight into your courage and determination that you've shown campaigning over the past 2 decades and the experiences you've gained along the way. And you mentioned that you felt that you owed it to people the Rank Outsider campaign that had come before you to pick up the baton. It's very clear that you've done that, and I'm sure there are hundreds and thousands of people that whose names we'll never know who benefit from the work that you and your generation, your peer group, the changes that you're able to make. We've got a little bit of time now for a few questions. If people want to ask a question or share an experience, we've got about 7-8 minutes before I have to wrap things up. David was first. David, do you want to go?
Craig, hi, good evening. I think last time we were on a Zoom together, it was when we were giving evidence in Parliament. I just wanted to say on behalf of the Citizenship Soldier campaign, just kind of show our solidarity. You did some fantastic work, and if we can help in any way, just give us a shout. But my question was more around how do you go about actually compensating these people? Because how do you know whether they'd have gone on to become generals and stay for 22 years or leave as sergeants, after 5 years? How does that compensation, what does that look like, and what are you kind of campaigning for on that front?
A brilliant question. It's incredibly complicated and arguably impossible, not least because people were exited from the armed forces in lots of different ways. We're campaigning for restorative justice for people who were constructively dismissed for many, many different reasons, or people who were just worn down so much that they resigned. We're also campaigning for people who have already received some level of derisory compensation, because MOD strung out the compensation claims until 2009, took 9 years after the ban was lifted. So what we've said is that we need community advocacy. And there is a great precedence for this in the LGBT plus Purge Fund in Canada, whereby a single endowment of 250 million Canadian dollars was made into a fund which is managed in partnership between government actuaries and LGBT plus community leaders. And that enables us to take a sensible, practical viewpoint. It would run something like the Armed Forces Covenant Trust Fund, I always get those in the wrong order, which is a non-departmental government trust. If ideally that would allow us to take a broad view upon what actually happened to people.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave, for the question, and thanks, Craig, for the response. Michael had a question, I think.
Yes, thanks, Chair. The first part of my remarks, I think, is also directed at Luke Pollard, or in Luke Pollard's direction. Yes, there's a lot of hurt about LGBT people in the armed forces. Part of the hurt for me, as not only somebody who's gay, but somebody who's is the Labour Party, is the Labour Party actually argued for the ban to continue in front of the European Court of Human Rights. And if you read Jeff Hoon's statement, and I can give you chapter and verse if you like, 12th of January 2000, Hansard, volume 342, Jeff Hoon's statement can at best be described as begrudging. He made it absolutely clear that the Labour government was only raising the ban because it was no longer legally sustainable. So if Labour's going to take any credit for it, it also has to make absolutely explicit that they did argue for the ban to continue. The second point that I'd like to make, I suppose in one sense, I was one of the lucky ones in that I never really had any trouble. But I still get flashbacks to the witch hunts and the backlash, and I mean, not in any PTSD sort of way, but it still makes your guts go into knots when you think about some of these things. And I still, even now, when I'm talking to colleagues, even though they know that I'm gay, I still find it difficult to actually say those magic words. So it's not just issues for people who were thrown out, or even though they're the worst, and the people who were ignored, they're the people being treated worst. There's a lot of people whose lives were affected very badly because, like Craig, we wanted to do our bit. We wanted to have that boy's own career and, stand on in the forecastle with a just jaw out at sea. But we suffered because of it. Craig asked me to do this when we were serving together. I gave a speech to the Royal Naval Chaplains Association, and the bit that hurt most, and actually strangely enough, it was one of the things that affected even the anti-gay chaplains who were there, was at the point at which I said, in order to get into the armed forces, I had to lie. I had to say that I wasn't gay. I had to be something that I wasn't. And I think that's what really hurts about the whole thing. So, sorry, that's me, thank you.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for sharing that. I don't know if Craig or Luke want to comment on any of the issues you raised.
I don't mind offering a couple of comments. I mean, I understand Michael's point in that Jeff Hoon, I remember listening to it very clearly, said we cannot pick and choose the laws that we wish to implement, even though many in our armed forces would not wish to see this law changed. I have to say, actually, though, it wasn't clean cut that after the European Court ruled that the ban would be lifted. And although a little begrudged, I was pleased to see that Labour took it through. And they were part of slow improvements over the years. But actually, I think what really matters to me at the moment is that for the generations that were most hurt by this ban, Labour is very strongly supporting us on this journey, and we're very grateful to that.
That's right.
Yeah, Toby, if I could just briefly add to what Craig has said there. I think, Michael, I mean, it's a fair challenge, Michael. And, as someone who's been out for as long as I've been a Labour member, it has been a fight within our party to see the right values prevail. Because when I first joined the party, there was not an automatic read across that social justice and equality meant LGBT equality. And indeed, there's still challenges within our movement to explain that LGBT equality means T equality as well as LGBT equality. So we still have a fight to go. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do need to mark these important moments. We do need to tell the stories about how we got here. And we need to tell the story about what happened since these things happened. Because in my remarks earlier, I mentioned that it's not just the moment, the law change, the bit of paper that changes. It's the culture that changes from that. That's where you achieve the real victory. And I think there's lots for us to do. But as a gay MP, I know that nearly all the political figures that I admire from the past were not in favour of my right to exist. And it is something that is always worth remembering sometimes in the back of your head. Many of those historic figures in our movement and in the country as a whole, had different views when it came to gay people and LGBT folks. And so we still have a fight on our hands, but it's a fair point, Michael, and you made it very well.
So thank you both to Craig and Luke. I'm a nice, mild-mannered fellow, but thank you for letting me drain all over you tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Thanks for sharing that and asking the question. That's great. Time for one more question, and then otherwise we'll run over time. If anyone else has a question they wanted to raise, if you email me, and I'll forward it on to Luke or Craig as appropriate if you're happy with that. So the final question goes to Kate, please.
Mine was just Sorry, mine was just a bit of awareness around trans, right, and LGBT, you know, which I don't think people actually understand, right, yeah, around trans serving. You know, I did a presentation at the first Veterans Ball that we had, right, in the Union Jack Club, and I did a fuller one. And I think Caroline was there, Craig, when I did it at Wolverhampton Pride, one of the years, about the service that trans people have given in the service. A lot of people, even in the LGBT community, don't understand it. You know, I'm happy to continue and sort of make a thing there. Trans people have served in Her Majesty's forces through time, going back to Nelson's Navy. I don't know whether people are aware of it. William Chandler, who was born Mary Lucy, and there's a number of them, and a number of them fought in the American Revolution and independence. But more recent times, we have Dr. James Barry, who served in the First World War as a medical doctor, born Margaret Ann Buckley, who survived and wasn't caught out and managed to join the forces and was a doctor in the First World War. It's only when on his passing that they found out, right there, it was actually Margaret Ann Buckley. And, you know, moving on to Roberta Carroll, who was born Robert Marshall, who served right there in the RAF during the Second World War. And one was one of the first ones right there who had surgery. That's just an insight. There's a whole host of them right there if you do your, oh, whoops, can't see it all. Loads of pages there with lots of them. So I'm not going to bore you because I know you want to move on. But, you know, if people can be mindful, you know, trans people have served, and it goes back. Nelson's Navy had the thing where they went jailed, they were thrown out, and even, right, some of them were given naval pensions. So it was a little bit different where, you know, in those times, it was more accepted and they got their pension and that. But, you know, coming forward to what we're talking about now, where they lost the pensions and they lost all their rights. I'll finish on that one. Thank you.
Thank you. That's really, really useful, really important bit of context that you rightly say is not even overlooked, isn't understood or even known.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know it unless you look into it and that, then you don't know.
Yeah. I think there's at least another whole hour's worth of content there we could pick up on. But thanks for that. I think I'm probably going to have to draw stumps, I'm afraid. We've got 1 minute to. If anyone else has got a question they want me to pass on to Craig or to Luke, if they send me an email, I'm happy to do so. Just to sum up, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you to our speakers, to Luke and to Craig. That was hugely interesting and valuable insight into some of the background into where we are today and into the remaining challenges that we need to seize as a Labour Party, as a movement, and for us as an organisation, as the link between the party and the forces community, and make sure that everyone who needs to be talking to each other is doing so, and that there's an increased level of mutual understanding. Coming up, obviously, thanks to John, we've got an event next week with John Healey and David Lammy. I'll push out details as soon as we hear about that. Following that, we're at Scottish Labour Conference. We've got a fringe event hosted by Paul Sweeney, MSP, next Friday. Is our next event and our first in-person event since conference in Brighton last year. If you enjoyed tonight and you're not a member, please do sign up. Go to labourforces.org. You can sign up there. And if you really, really enjoyed tonight, whether you're a member or not, you can also donate there, and we can raise some funds to put on other events like tonight and some more in-person events. Thank you all very much for your time, and I'll see you all soon.
Thank you.